In pretty much every single video I've uploaded recently in which I actually climb up to altitude in a top tier match, I find several comments of people asking how do I climb up to altitude without just eating an R-27ER or a Sparrow, how am I surviving? And so in this video we're going to be covering just that, but not just with altitude, but pretty much every single basic tactic there is for not dying to a SAR missile, a semi-active radar homing missile. If you're new here and you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate if you subscribe. I am almost at 30,000 subscribers, only about 2,000 more to go, so any subscription I can get is going to help drastically and I really appreciate it. And I do want to clarify that I am going to be pretty much only talking about top tier combat and top tier tactics when it comes to these missile evasions, so keep that in mind throughout the video. Let's go ahead and get started with our first tactic. This one is pretty straightforward. I think most people kind of already know this, but simply fly low to the ground and you cannot die to a SAR missile in War Thunder. And when I say low to the ground, I mean pretty much treetop level. You really don't want to get any higher than maybe 50 meters at the most off of the ground. And it's really not that difficult to do. The only part where it really gets tricky is if you start running into mountains or hills, canyons, stuff like that, that will actually change your altitude according to your AGL, above ground level altitude, in which case the missile might end up hitting you anyways, because as you're going over that ditch in the ground, you're technically not as low as you were anymore, and it smacks you. The most important thing to keep in mind is these missiles are still going to try to calculate your last known flight path, and sometimes they can still just run into you anyways, or in the case of the Phoenix, it has so much explosive filler that it might end up hitting you with splash damage. So try to change your path along the ground like you see me doing on screen to avoid it just running into you and splashing you anyway. If you're at really low altitudes, you know that the person locking you up with their radar is in pulse Doppler mode of some kind. Pulse Doppler pretty much only detects targets moving toward and away from the radar, and so what notching is flying perpendicular or 90 degrees in relation to the radar. Depending on what the radar set is that is locking you, it is going to be easier or harder to actually notch it. This is an F-14A locking me right now, so it's actually pretty easy for me to turn 90 degrees and just notch his radar. You see on screen he loses lock and the missile stops tracking. I didn't have to use any chaff or anything like that because since I was at such low altitude, I knew for certain that he had to be in pulse Doppler. The problem is once you go to a little bit higher altitude like you see me doing right now, he can actually switch modes from pulse Doppler to normal SRC mode, and notching isn't going to work. So at higher altitudes we have to throw a little bit of something into the notch, and that's just going to be chaff. We're going to do the exact same thing as we do at low altitude, but instead of just simply flying 90 degrees, we're going to be dropping chaff as we're doing that. And let me make this very clear for those of you who don't know how chaff works. This is the only way that chaff is actually reliable and consistent at decoying radar missiles. You have to be notching while you're deploying it. If you're just flying straight at the enemy or at a slight offset angle and you're dropping chaff and you're wondering why it's not fooling the missile, it's because these top tier SAR missiles have CW guidance, in which they actually basically kind of can tell when there's chaff being deployed and continue tracking their target anyways. It's only on a pulse missile where you can just drop chaff and it'll decoy it as if it were something like a flare to an IR missile. So on these top tier modern missiles with CW guidance, you have to be notching as you're dropping the chaff. What you're seeing me do right now is how I survive at altitude and not eat these SAR missiles. When I see a missile launched at me, or if I see one on the RWR launched at me, I put that missile 90 degrees off of my wingtip as well as the incoming radar, and I start dropping chaff until it basically goes away and I'm not getting RWR anymore. If not that, sometimes you can visually confirm that the missile has been decoyed and it starts tracking something else, and then you know you're safe. This method works regardless of what your speed is. You see, I kind of just imitated as if I was dogfighting somebody at high altitude, low speed. I'm getting third-partied by the SAR missile, but it's okay because as long as I have chaff and I can turn 90 degrees here while dropping this chaff, I can actually decoy the missile. It is important to note that not every single SAR missile is the same. Some of them are fooled easier than others. The Sparrow and the 530D are a lot easier to fool than the R27ER and the R27R. It's also important to note that it takes a lot of chaff to reliably do this, and especially takes a lot of chaff on the difficult missiles like the R27R and the ER. I'd really only recommend going to altitude in planes with a lot of countermeasures like the Gripen, the F-15C, the Su-27, the F-16C, and so on. Rear aspect SAR missiles are a little bit tricky. It really just comes down to notching the radar rather than doing anything with chaff or the missile. As you can see, sometimes it's luck and I just notch the radar, but other times it hits me. If you're going fast enough, you can actually just simply outmaneuver some of these missiles. And by some of them, I mean all of them except the R-27s. There are some dependent variables at play, of course. Like I said, your speed matters a lot, the missile's speed matters a lot, but more often than not, as long as you're going fast enough, you can pull this maneuver that you just watched me do every single time, and you will not die to any of these SAR missiles, again, except for the R-27, which we'll touch on at the end of the video. All the maneuver is pretty much a barrel roll. I'm using my ailerons, my elevators, and my rudder. The rudder is the key thing here. You have to use the rudder, and you just use all three flight controls to do a roll in which you end it going down. The main issue with this maneuver is timing is everything. If you can't see the missile coming, as in like maybe the smoke trail has already burned out and the missile marker's gone, it is going to be incredibly difficult to actually time it. The good news is though, that usually would mean it's slower, and if it's slower it becomes even easier to outroll, like you're seeing me do on screen. If you've been watching me from any length of time, you know that I think the R27ER is complete bullshit, and you're going to be seeing why. That cool little roll trick we did just a second ago to outmaneuver the missiles and continue our joust into the enemy, well, that doesn't work on the ER. The ER is simply too fast, its tracking rate is too good, the Seeker in general is just too good, it's too fast. There's no way you can reliably and consistently outmaneuver this thing. Does it happen? Yes, it's happened to me. I've seen people do it. I've done it myself. You can get lucky and outmaneuver an ER, but in any kind of consistent, replicatable fashion, I don't know, you're going to be pretty hard pressed to figure something out. Altitude does not matter to it, and the only time you're actually going to be doing it reliably is if the launch is really close range, in which you can just outpull anyways, or if it's really far range and it's just too slow at that point. And by the way, the R27R is the exact same. It's really hard to outroll that thing. The Seeker is just too strong. It will not lose track of you. The other really annoying thing about the R27 is that it's really difficult to notch and chaff. It takes a lot of chaff to be able to actually consistently notch and chaff this thing, and even then it's a really difficult missile to do this with. If you're not hitting that notch absolutely perfectly, it is going to not care and hit you anyways. It is substantially more difficult than doing it to something like a Sparrow or a 530D. On top of that, the R27 is the only missile that can lose lock for longer than 3 seconds and then regain lock and start tracking again. And with an abrupt ending, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you.
Do zwiedzenia.